On the morning of the 2nd of November 1942, a German reconnaissance pilot flew his Fieseler Phi 156 Storch over the British position south of El Alamein. Below him, stretched across 20 kilometres of desert, sat what appeared to be a massive transport depot. Hundreds of lorries, supply trucks, and 3-ton Bedford transports arranged in neat columns. He noted the coordinates, radioed his observations to headquarters, and recommended against wasting precious artillery shells on soft-skinned vehicles. 3 hours later, those same lorries threw off their disguises and led the armoured breakthrough that would shatter the Afrika Korps' defensive line. The pilot had been staring at nearly 200 Crusader, Grant and Sherman tanks, each one concealed beneath a contraption that shouldn't have fooled anyone with binoculars, let alone trained reconnaissance officers. Yet it did. Repeatedly, throughout the entire North African campaign. The device was called a Sunshield, and on paper, it was absurd. Take a 27-ton tank, drape it with a wooden frame covered in Hessian cloth, and somehow convince the enemy it's a 3-ton lorry. The Germans had superior optics. Their Zeiss 10x50 binoculars could resolve details the British SF 41 models missed. Their aerial reconnaissance was methodical and frequent. Their intelligence officers had served in the desert since 1941 and knew the difference between tracked and wheeled vehicles from dust patterns alone. This shouldn't have worked. It definitely shouldn't have worked more than once. Yet British armoured units employed Sunshields from Operation Crusader in November 1941 through the final pursuit into Tunisia in May 1943. They used them not occasionally, not as a desperate improvisation, but as standard operating procedure. Because whilst the contraptions looked ridiculous up close, from 3,000 feet or 2 miles away through shimmering desert heat, they turned the most valuable pieces on the chessboard invisible. And that invisibility wasn't a clever trick. It was systematic deception that consistently gave British commanders the initiative in choosing when and where to strike. The Germans didn't fall for cheap theatrics. They fell for a weapon that exploited the single most predictable factor in desert warfare. Everyone, on both sides, spent hours every day staring at vehicle parks through heat haze. Standard military doctrine in 1941 emphasized natural camouflage for armoured vehicles. The German manual, Merkblatt 42/1, specified that panzers should be positioned in defilade, hull down behind ridgelines, or dispersed among natural terrain features. When operating in open desert, units were instructed to maintain wide spacing, minimum 100 metres between vehicles, and to remain stationary during daylight reconnaissance periods. The Luftwaffe conducted systematic photographic surveys, and their intelligence staff had become expert at identifying the characteristic signatures of armoured formations, the distinctive track width of tanks, the blast patterns around gun positions, the circular guard patterns of lagered armoured units. The British initially followed similar principles. In the disastrous Operation Battle Axe of June 1941, British Matilda and Crusader tanks attempted to hide among wadis and behind the slight rises in the coastal plain. German observers spotted them anyway. The problem wasn't poor fieldcraft, it was that the western desert offered almost no natural concealment. Between the Mediterranean coast and the Qattara Depression, the terrain was largely flat gravel plain with occasional escarpments. What few wadis existed were obvious choke points. Height advantages of 3 or 4 metres, significant in European terrain, became meaningless when aerial observers could see 30 miles in every direction through crystalline desert air. The Germans held a significant advantage in reconnaissance aircraft. The Fieseler Storch could loiter at 80 km per hour, observing British positions for extended periods, whilst remaining nearly impossible to intercept. Its high wing design and excellent downward visibility made it ideal for spotting vehicles. More importantly, Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots flew the same routes repeatedly, becoming intimately familiar with the desert landscape. They could detect new vehicle tracks, fresh excavations, or unusual concentrations of equipment from subtle changes in ground appearance. A British armoured brigade couldn't simply arrive at a position without leaving obvious signs of its presence. Critics of deception measures argued that the sophisticated German reconnaissance system couldn't be fooled by crude disguises. Intelligence summaries captured after the war showed German confidence in their ability to track British armoured movements. One Afrika Korps intelligence officer wrote in August 1941, "The British make no serious attempt at concealment. Their tank formations can be identified from standard lager patterns and the movement of supply columns." This assessment wasn't arrogance. It was based on 18 months of successful armoured warfare, where German reconnaissance had consistently located British tank concentrations before major engagements. What actually appeared in British tank parks in September 1941 looked like something from a theatrical props department. The Mark I Sunshield, designed by Lieutenant Colonel Jasper Maskelyne's camouflage unit and refined by Royal Engineers, consisted of a wooden frame assembled from standard 6-foot lengths of 2x2 timber. The frame formed a rectangular box approximately 21 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 7 feet high. The rough dimensions of a Bedford QL 3-ton lorry. This frame sat on 4 metal posts that bolted directly to the tank's hull and turret. The entire structure was covered with Hessian fabric, treated with a mixture of sand-coloured paint and a waterproofing compound that prevented the cloth from becoming transparent when wet with morning dew. The specifications were precise because they had to be. A Bedford lorry measured 20 feet 11 inches in length, with a wheelbase of 11 feet 6 inches. Its cab height was 7 feet 4 inches, and the standard 3-ton body added another 2 feet of cargo bed. The Sunshield replicated these dimensions exactly, including painted-on details, black rectangles representing the cab windows, vertical lines suggesting the stake sides of the cargo bed, even shadows painted beneath the chassis to create the illusion of ground clearance. The key innovation was the side panels, which hung low enough to conceal the tank's tracks when viewed from any angle above 15 degrees, precisely the angle from which German reconnaissance aircraft typically observed British positions. For this to work in motion, the Sunshield had to be removable in under 3 minutes. British crews achieved this through a quick-release system using 4 large thumb screws and safety catches. When the order came to deploy, the tank commander could trigger all 4 releases from inside the turret. The crew would then simply drive forward at speed whilst 2 men standing on the hull pulled the collapsing frame backwards off the tank. The entire Sunshield, now folded flat, could be dragged clear and abandoned if necessary, or loaded onto an accompanying lorry if time permitted. 8th Army training exercises required crews to practice this throwing off procedure until they could execute it in under 2 minutes 30 seconds, even under simulated artillery fire. The weight penalty was minimal, approximately 200 pounds for the complete assembly, but the psychological resistance was enormous. Tank crews initially despised the contraptions. Sergeant Thomas Hardy of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment wrote in his diary, "We look like bloody travelling circuses. Jerry will laugh himself sick before he shoots us to pieces." The Sunshield's restricted visibility made the tanks more difficult to operate in tight formations and seemed to violate every principle of armoured warfare that emphasised speed and aggressive manoeuvre. Squadron commanders worried that the time required to deploy would leave them vulnerable if surprised by enemy reconnaissance. The proof arrived on the 18th of November 1941 during the opening phase of Operation Crusader. Threake's Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Willoughby Norrie, positioned the 7th Armoured Division's tank brigades, comprising 213 Crusader tanks and 166 American-built Stuart light tanks, in assembly areas south of the Omar Escarpment. Standard German reconnaissance flights passed over these positions twice daily, once at dawn, once at midday. The British had spent 3 days moving tanks into position under Sunshields, parking them in patterns that exactly mimicked supply depots. Each Sunshield-covered tank was positioned alongside actual lorries, and the crews had been instructed to maintain the same activity patterns as supply units. Periodic movement of individual vehicles, cooking fires in the same locations, tent lines set up in regulation patterns. German reconnaissance reports from 17 and 18 November identified the locations as probable supply concentration, with light defensive elements, primarily anti-tank guns and armoured cars. The intelligence summary distributed to Afrika Korps units on the evening of the 18th of November placed British armoured strength 15 miles further north, based on sightings of actual tank movements in that sector. When XXX Corps launched its attack on the morning of 19th November, German commanders were stunned by the sudden appearance of over 300 British tanks emerging from positions that intelligence had dismissed as logistics areas. The initial engagement proved the concept. The 7th Armoured Brigade struck the Italian Ariete Division's positions at Bir el Gubi, achieving complete tactical surprise. The Italian commander had positioned his M13/40 medium tanks and semoventi assault guns to defend against an attack from the north, based on German reconnaissance assessments. When British Crusaders appeared from the southeast, from the very supply depot his intelligence officers had noted, the Ariete Division's defensive positions were facing the wrong direction. In the subsequent 4-hour battle, the Italians lost 34 tanks destroyed and another 23 damaged, whilst the British 7th Brigade lost only 8 tanks to enemy action. More remarkably, the deception held even after the initial attack. On the 20th of November, German reconnaissance pilots reported British supply vehicles retreating south from several positions. These were Sunshield-equipped tanks withdrawing to rearm and refuel. Because the German observers expected to see lorries in those positions, having observed them for 3 days, they interpreted the vehicle's movement as a logistics retreat, not a tactical redeployment of armoured forces. This misidentification persisted for another 2 days, during which British tank units repeatedly disappeared by reassuming their Sunshield disguises and reappeared miles away when circumstances favoured attack. The captured diary of a German intelligence officer from the 15th Panzer Division recorded his frustration. Enemy tank forces appear and disappear, without corresponding vehicle movements in our reconnaissance logs. Either our pilots are incompetent or the British have developed a method of concealing armoured vehicles that defeats aerial observation. It wasn't incompetence, it was the first systematic exploitation of human pattern recognition against trained observers. The Germans were seeing exactly what was there: lorries in supply depots. They simply couldn't accept that 27-ton tanks could masquerade as 3-ton trucks, effectively enough to fool professional reconnaissance. This wasn't accidental theatrical cleverness. It was the deliberate exploitation of how human vision processes information at distance through atmospheric distortion. The designers of the Sunshield system understood something fundamental about desert reconnaissance. Accuracy depended entirely on the observers to recognize familiar patterns, and those patterns broke down at specific distances and atmospheric conditions. German reconnaissance aircraft typically observed British positions from altitudes between 2,000 and 4,000 feet, high enough to avoid light anti-aircraft fire, low enough to identify vehicle types. At 3,000 feet altitude, a Fieseler Storch pilot viewing a vehicle at a 45-degree angle was actually seeing it from approximately 4,200 feet of slant distance. At this range, through air heated to 40 degrees Celsius by the desert surface, atmospheric shimmer created a distortion effect equivalent to looking through water. The human eye's resolution limit, approximately 1 arc-minute under ideal conditions, meant that details smaller than 1.2 feet could not be reliably distinguished. A tank's track width, typically 15 inches, fell right at this threshold. The painted details on a Sunshield's side panels, the false cab windows, the stake sides, were each approximately 18 to 24 inches in their major dimension, comfortably above the resolution limit. The principle extended to ground observation through binoculars. German positions frequently observed British deployments from ranges of 3 to 5 miles across the desert floor. At 4 miles through midday heat shimmer, even excellent 10 by 50 binoculars couldn't reliably distinguish between a lorry's squared cargo bed and a Sunshield's rectangular profile. The critical factor was familiarity. German observers had seen thousands of Bedford lorries over 18 months of desert warfare. They knew what lorries looked like in every light condition, from every angle, at every distance. The Sunshield designers weren't trying to create a perfect illusion. They were creating something that matched the mental template German observers had built from extensive experience. Commanders weren't clinging to theatrical tricks. They knew that military intelligence depends on predictive patterns. When a German intelligence officer observed 50 vehicles in a position marked as a supply depot, and those vehicles maintained behaviour consistent with logistics units, regular but limited movement, cooking fires, tent lines, his training told him these were supply lorries. Even if individual vehicles looked slightly unusual through heat shimmer, the overall pattern matched expectations. Intelligence work requires making thousands of identification decisions daily. Observers don't scrutinize every vehicle with skeptical intensity. They categorize based on context and behavior patterns. The deception worked because battlefields aren't controlled experiments where observers examine isolated subjects. They're chaotic environments where intelligence officers must process massive amounts of visual information, prioritize threats, and distribute their attention across dozens of locations simultaneously. The Sunshield exploited this cognitive reality. It didn't need to fool a trained observer who spent 30 minutes examining a single vehicle under ideal conditions. It needed to pass a 3-second evaluation by a pilot flying a reconnaissance route, or a 10-second scan by a forward observer who was also tracking artillery impacts, monitoring his own unit's movements, and watching for enemy counter-reconnaissance. The most sophisticated employment of Sunshields came during Operation Bertram, the deception plan for the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Richardson's deception staff planned a reversal operation that would become the textbook example of how to hide an armoured concentration in plain sight. The goal was to conceal the movement of ex-Corps armoured divisions, approximately 300 tanks, from positions in the southern sector to jump-off positions in the northern sector, while simultaneously convincing German intelligence that British armoured strength remained concentrated in the south. The operation began on the 26th of October 1942, 6 days before the planned offensive. Each night, under blackout conditions, approximately 50 tanks would move from southern positions to northern assembly areas. Upon arrival, before dawn, each tank would don its Sunshield disguise. Simultaneously in the southern sector, 50 actual lorries would be fitted with cannibal devices, reverse Sunshields that made 3-ton trucks look like 27-ton tanks. The cannibals were even cruder than Sunshields, plywood frames covered with painted canvas, creating a tank-shaped silhouette with a dummy gun barrel. From aerial reconnaissance altitude in the blue-grey light of dawn, they were indistinguishable from real armoured vehicles. The choreography was precise. German reconnaissance flights typically occurred at 700 hours and 1200 hours. British tank movements happened between 0200 and 0500, completing before dawn. Each Sunshield had to be fully deployed, with crews concealed in nearby slit trenches before first light. In the southern sector, cannibal disguised lorries had to be positioned exactly where tanks had been photographed the previous day, keeping the illusion that armoured strength remained unchanged. The operation required moving 6,000 tons of armoured vehicles across 15 miles of desert over 6 consecutive nights without detection. German reconnaissance reports from 27th October through 1st November showed no awareness of the deception. Daily intelligence summaries continued to place British armoured strength primarily in the southern sector. The captured war diary of Panzer Army Africa headquarters recorded vehicle counts from reconnaissance flights. Northern sector, supply concentration, approximately 250 vehicles, primarily soft-skinned. Southern sector, armoured Liga approximately 280 tanks, 90 armoured cars. The actual distribution was almost exactly reversed. Over 300 tanks now in the north, disguised as lorries, whilst fewer than 100 remained in the south, their numbers artificially inflated by cannibal disguised trucks. When Operation Lightfoot launched at 21:40 hours on 23 October 1942, the preliminary artillery barrage was immediately followed by the armoured advance. Crews threw off their Sunshields in under 3 minutes, and ex-Corps tanks moved forward according to schedule. German forward observers reported massive armoured attack from unexpected direction at 20:05 hours. The headquarters staff of the 15th Panzer Division, positioned to counter an expected armoured thrust in the south, received orders to redeploy north at 22:45 hours, over an hour into the battle. That delay, caused by the successful deception, allowed British armour to penetrate the first defensive belt before German panzers could establish blocking positions. After Operation Crusader, German intelligence officers began studying captured examples of British deception equipment. Several Sunshields were recovered intact when British tanks were knocked out before crews could remove the disguises. Technical intelligence reports analysed the construction, noting the crude materials and simple design. One report from February 1942 acknowledged, "The British device is primitive but effective at distances exceeding 2 kilometres under desert atmospheric conditions." Recommendations included more frequent reconnaissance flights at varied times, lower altitude observation runs to catch vehicles during disguise changes, and increased use of ground agents to verify aerial observations. None of these recommendations were systematically implemented. The reason wasn't German incompetence or bureaucratic inertia, it was resource constraints and battlefield priorities. Lower altitude reconnaissance missions meant greater aircraft losses to British anti-aircraft fire. The Luftwaffe in North Africa was chronically short of both aircraft and fuel. Every reconnaissance sortie competed with ground attack missions and fighter patrols for limited resources. More frequent observation flights would have required additional aircraft that simply weren't available. The Afrika Korps was fighting a mobile campaign across hundreds of miles of front, with supply lines stretched to breaking point. Diverting reconnaissance assets to verify the identity of vehicle parks in rear areas seemed an unjustifiable luxury when those same assets were needed to locate British artillery positions, identify supply dumps for bombing, and monitor coastal shipping. The deeper problem was doctrinal. German armoured doctrine emphasised aggressive reconnaissance, rapid probing attacks by panzer and armoured car units to locate enemy positions through contact. This approach had worked brilliantly in France and Poland, where mobile operations could force enemy units to reveal themselves through movement. In the desert's vast distances, it was less effective. British positions often sat 40 or 50 miles behind front lines, too far for ground reconnaissance to probe without mounting a major operation. German commanders had grown reliant on aerial reconnaissance precisely because ground reconnaissance couldn't efficiently cover the distances involved. British forces understood this dependency and built their deception operations around it. The Sunshield wasn't a clever improvisation, it was a systematic exploitation of how their opponent conducted intelligence gathering. Major David Strangeways, who coordinated tactical deception in the Mediterranean theatre, wrote after the war, "The Germans were excellent soldiers, but they were predictable in their intelligence methods. Once we understood they relied heavily on aerial reconnaissance at specific times, we could build deception plans that exploited those patterns. The Sunshield worked because it targeted the German intelligence system's most consistent vulnerability. What made the Sunshield effective wasn't any single feature, but rather its integration into a comprehensive deception philosophy. British commanders in North Africa developed a systematic approach to battlefield deception that treated it not as a supporting trick but as a primary weapon system. This philosophy had several components that made individual deceptions like the Sunshield far more effective than they would have been in isolation. First, deception operations were planned as carefully as combat operations. The wireless deception units transmitted false radio traffic, mimicking armoured formations in deceptive locations. Dummy artillery positions fired precisely timed harassing shots to suggest battery positions where none existed. Supply units created false logistics trails by running empty trucks back and forth between real and dummy positions. The Sunshield disguised tanks weren't isolated lies. They were part of a consistent false narrative that multiple intelligence sources would confirm. When a German reconnaissance pilot saw lorries in a supply depot, and signals intelligence detected supply unit radio traffic from that location, and the artillery plotting sections noted harassing fire consistent with defensive positions, the pilot's identification seemed confirmed by independent sources. Second, British deception doctrine recognised that the best lies are mostly true. Operation Bertram succeeded not because it created pure fiction, but because it manipulated timing and location of real activities. Tanks genuinely needed to move from southern to northern positions for the offensive. That movement couldn't be prevented. The deception made that movement invisible by disguising its timing. Similarly, supply concentrations really did exist in rear areas. The Sunshield simply mixed combat vehicles among genuine logistics units. German intelligence was seeing real activities, just interpreting them incorrectly based on visual misidentification of vehicle types. Third, the British learned to sustain deceptions even after initial discovery. When German forces eventually identified Sunshield-equipped units during combat, British formations didn't abandon the technique. They knew that the next German reconnaissance would be looking for confirmation that British units had learned from their exposure. By continuing to use Sunshields in modified patterns, sometimes fewer per unit, sometimes in different positions, sometimes mixed with genuine lorries in different ratios, they forced German intelligence to treat every vehicle park as potentially suspect. This uncertainty was almost as valuable as complete deception, because it meant German commanders had to assume any supply depot might actually be an armoured concentration. The principle extended beyond the Sunshield itself. The British also developed cannibal operations where actual tanks were stripped down and temporarily withdrawn, whilst their Sunshield disguises were placed on lorries to maintain the appearance of armoured presence. They created entire dummy tank formations using inflatable rubber tanks, crude devices that nonetheless passed aerial observation. They positioned armoured cars with Sunshields to create false impressions of tank squadron strength. The ecosystem of deception meant that German intelligence officers couldn't simply add check for Sunshields to their reconnaissance checklist. Every British vehicle position became ambiguous, requiring closer inspection, lower altitude observation, or ground verification, all of which consumed German resources and time. The effectiveness of these deceptions translated directly into casualties and battlefield outcomes. During the breakout from El Alamein in early November 1942, German defensive planning assumed British armoured strength would concentrate along specific axes based on reconnaissance assessments. The 21st Panzer Division established defensive positions to block what intelligence indicated was the primary armoured thrust, a concentration of approximately 150 tanks in the southern sector. That concentration was largely cannibal-disguised lorries. Meanwhile, the actual British armoured breakthrough, led by X-Corps' 300 tanks from the northern sector, hit German positions that were defending against what intelligence had assessed as a secondary logistics area. The 21st Panzer Division's war diary from the 4th of November 1942 records the consequences. Enemy armour appeared in overwhelming strength from sectors previously identified as supply concentration, unable to establish defensive line, casualties significant. The division lost 38 panzers destroyed, another 27 damaged, and over 400 personnel in the first day of what should have been a prepared defensive action. These losses weren't the result of British armoured superiority. German Panzer IIIs and IVs were roughly equivalent to British Crusaders and Grants in direct combat. The casualties resulted from German units being positioned to defend against attacks that weren't coming, whilst British attacks materialised from directions German intelligence had discounted. Private Wilhelm Schmidt, a Panzer crewman captured during the battle, told his interrogators, "We knew the British were to the south. Intelligence had photographed their positions for 5 days. When we were ordered to defend against an attack from the north, we thought command had made a mistake. Then the Tommies came from exactly where command said they would, and we realised intelligence had been wrong for 5 days. That realisation, that their intelligence system had been systematically deceived, had psychological effects beyond the immediate tactical defeat. German units began questioning reconnaissance assessments, leading to caution and delayed reactions that further degraded combat effectiveness. The human cost extended to German reconnaissance crews as well. When Luftwaffe intelligence officers realised that aerial reconnaissance had been consistently fooled by British deceptions, they mandated lower altitude observation runs and more detailed vehicle inspections. This requirement increased losses among reconnaissance aircraft. Between November 1942 and January 1943, Luftflotte 2 lost 17 reconnaissance aircraft to British anti-aircraft fire, triple the previous 3-month period. These losses came from pilots flying lower and slower to verify vehicle identities, making themselves vulnerable to weapons that previously couldn't engage high-altitude reconnaissance flights. The Sunshield remained in British service until the end of the North African campaign in May 1943. Over 18 months, British forces manufactured approximately 1,400 Sunshield units and trained tank crews across 7 armoured divisions in their deployment. The technique spread beyond British Commonwealth forces. American tank units arriving in North Africa in late 1942 adopted modified versions of the Sunshield system for their M3 Grant and M4 Sherman tanks. The principle of systematic deception as integral to armoured operations became doctrine in both British and American armoured warfare training. Post-war analysis by both British and German military historians identified the Sunshield as one of the most cost-effective tactical innovations of the North African campaign. Each Sunshield cost approximately £12 to manufacture, timber, hessian, paint and metal fittings, and took 2 soldiers roughly 4 hours to construct. The alternative cost of moving a tank undetected would have required either accepting losses to preemptive German artillery and air attack, or conducting elaborate tactical movements to mask intentions. The Sunshield achieved tactical surprise at negligible cost, repeatedly, throughout a campaign where surprise was usually impossible to achieve in the desert's open terrain. German military doctrine never effectively countered the system. Captured German tactical manuals from 1943 include warnings about British camouflage techniques, but provide no systematic method for defeating Sunshield deceptions beyond conduct more thorough reconnaissance. This recommendation was operationally impossible given Luftwaffe resource constraints and the inherent limitations of aerial observation through desert atmospheric conditions. The British had found a weakness in German battlefield intelligence, dependence on predictable aerial reconnaissance, and exploited it systematically. The Germans recognized the problem but never developed an affordable solution. The broader lesson transcended the specific technical details of canvas-covered frames on tank hulls. It demonstrated that deception operations could be planned and executed as rigorously as combat operations, with measurable effects on battlefield outcomes. It proved that crude physical disguises could defeat sophisticated reconnaissance if they targeted the right vulnerabilities in enemy intelligence systems. Most importantly, it showed that apparent absurdities, making tanks look like lorries, could become deadly serious advantages when designed around how enemies actually gathered and processed information. The Sunshield looked ridiculous because it was ridiculous in principle. A wooden frame with painted canvas shouldn't fool trained reconnaissance observers. Yet on the 2nd of November 1942, and dozens of times before and after, it did exactly that. Not through theatrical cleverness, but through systematic exploitation of human perception's limitations at distance, German reliance on predictable reconnaissance patterns, and the battlefield reality that intelligence officers must make rapid categorization decisions based on pattern recognition. The Germans didn't fall for it because they were incompetent. They fell for it because the British designed a system that made the correct decision, identifying disguised tanks, functionally indistinguishable from the expected decision, cataloguing supply vehicles. In desert warfare, where atmospheric conditions, degraded observation and vast distances made verification costly, that ambiguity was enough, every time.